Hey everyone, we are back with our Reformed Theology series, and it's been a little while, but I thought we would start our second video today. And again, before we jump in, just remember if you do appreciate the video, you can hit the like and subscribe button. It helps me, again, understand who is appreciating this, who's being benefited by it, and it helps build a community to also help direct kind of the conversation of what's needed content-wise, and it also just helps me know if just to keep doing it, and it's just something I do on the side, and I appreciate doing it, and I appreciate the conversations and the comments and those that subscribe, because it's an enjoyable experience to do something and to just share, I think the truth of the Christian faith, along with the unique distinctives of the Reformed faith within the Christian worldview. So today we were going to talk about the second part of just this very broad series on Reformed theology, and I thought today we would discuss a very interrelated truths of two doctrines of creation and providence today, and midway through probably just share a couple short books also that might be helpful as well as you read and research. And there's a lot of material out there. Reformed people are known for writing some books. So let's just kind of start first by saying, what is the doctrine of creation and what makes it reformed? What's the reformed doctrine of creation? And then we'll talk a little bit about providence and give you kind of the traditional reformed perspective on providence, which is a very developed, dense doctrine for reformed people. Though providence has a little bit more of a indebtedness to the Puritan tradition within the Reformed faith. It develops that doctrine more than others in our faith have previously. So first, kind of just, I want to be succinct here and just kind of give you the business without going too far into the weeds, though we're going to try to share the uniqueness of what makes these doctrines reformed, because all Christians believe in creation and providence. So, you have to. It's in the Bible. So, but what makes them reformed? And so I hope to kind of tack on that to help you see the unique perspective that Reformed theology has on these doctrines. So the first is creation. Essentially, what is the doctrine of creation? To put it very succinctly, it is a free act of God. It's God's action that is in line with His decree. So His decree, or His perfect thought, thinking perfectly of His will, right? Both foreknowledge and foreordination go together in the Reformed faith. They're not separate ideas or kind of successive things or something like that. They're really one and the same. But it's really the initial active work of God to create something that is contingent. Okay, so I'll say that again. It's the free act of God, really in an active initial sense, where He actually creates something that is contingent, not necessary, to use Thomas's terms there. God is the only necessary being according to Aquinas. Very true, right? Everything else is contingent or dependent upon God, right? So the creation of the world is His action that creates a dependent relationship between what He has made and who He is, right? But He is not dependent upon the creation. That's why most confessions in the Protestant and Catholic traditions will say creation is a free act of God. Now, I want to say just a side note about that for a second. It's important to know that just because it's a free act of God and God doesn't need the world, doesn't mean that God's not involved, okay? And I think there becomes this problem sometimes for Reformed people, that when they say this idea of God's created the world and it's a free act of God and He doesn't need the world, suddenly it creates this kind of distance and kind of this disassociation with the world, and that's not what it's intended to do. So I do like Jonathan Edwards' thought on creation a little bit more here, along with Herman Bavinck, because I think they get this right better, is that there's a sense in which God creates because, to use just a very a layperson expression, He can't help Himself. It's not because He needs the world, but there's such a desire to share, there's such a desire to show and to speak. God is pure act. John 5 says, when Jesus quotes, we quote Jesus here in John 5, my Father's always working. There's this sense of He does because it is a thing God would do, okay? But it doesn't mean that it was necessary. It doesn't mean that it was contingent that it was dependent in some sense. God's dependent upon the creation, or somehow the creation was a necessary thing. It is a free act of God. It's His free choice to make. but it's not a disassociated thing. It's very connected to God. And I'll lean on Bavinck here a little bit, but Bavinck says God is the being and the world is becoming. God is not becoming and the world is not being. And so, those are some philosophical words to use there, but it's essentially saying that God is the absolute immutable creation, okay? And the reality is that the world itself is a becoming, contingent, dependent relationship that God has established. And what goes and mediates between that? Well, how does God create the world? By divine word. So the divine word is what creates that. It's what also sustains that. And so it's important to know that just because God is creating the world out of freedom, not necessity, doesn't mean that there's a disassociation or a disinterest from God. God desires to show and to share and to speak because that's just what God's like. But it doesn't mean that the world is somehow fulfilling him or he's becoming more satisfied or the world is somehow him realizing himself. That's kind of Hegelian or the modern Enlightenment or the Enlightenment in its modern ramifications, okay? So the reality of all that is we need to say a few things about both sides of that. A lot of times people just say, God doesn't need the world. Well, true, he doesn't need it to fulfill himself or anything, but he loves the world, right? So there's a dependent relationship of the world on God. Man was made for God. God is not, for man in that sense. But there's also this relationship of grace, okay? And in that grace, God desires to share and to show and to speak. And that's a beautiful thing about God. And I think there are some Reformed theologians that just get that relationship better. And I would say Jonathan Edwards for sure, and Herman Bavinck for sure as well. So how does God create? He creates by divine fiat, divine word. And as he creates by divine word, he not only creates but sustains. So it's not as the deist would say that God creates and then leaves, right? God creates and then sustains, all right? He sustains by the word. So he speaks the word into existence. And then the theologians like to say that there's a creation in an active sense and then in a passive sense. The creation in the active sense is God's action, okay, of speech that creates. And creation in a passive sense is the organism, as Bavinck likes to say, the organon, of the universe that is now dependent upon God, okay? And that's more the passive sense of creation, okay? So can't agree with people that say that God's just always creating in that same sense. Do you see what I'm saying? God is creating in an active sense in this moment, this one moment. But yet in a passive sense, that creation is being sustained, okay, because it's now its own entity. It's in a sense, it has its own identity in some sense. God has created, but it's dependent upon the Creator. So that's a little bit of a nuance that we need to make sure we get in there. Why does God create? And the simple answer is for his glory, but what does glory even mean? Right? That's kind of the challenge. And this is where we get more into the Reformed take on this doctrine. God creates for his glory, but what does glory mean? It's not just worship. It's the perfections of God being shown through, luminous, radiating through all of creation. God creates to share, to show, and to speak. God creates because God is a creating God. And he wants to share, to show, and to speak to his creation. The glory of God is really, as I think the Reformed tradition really hit it on the head here, is that glory is the consummation, okay? The consummation of creation. But yet glory is in creation, okay? So Bavinck and Edwards and others say it really well by saying grace is glory begun, and glory is grace finished or consummated. So that kind of creation consummation idea, where there's kind of a teleological goal and direction in mind, even from the first moment God speaks creation to existence and then sustains it by his word, it's already there in the creation. So for the Reformed, what makes it a Reformed doctrine of creation is that there is a teleology to it where glory is connected to grace and grace is connected to glory. And there's a trajectory of it towards the final day. But the final day is already hinted at in the very first day, okay? And that's why for, Romans 8, you see Paul and the Reformed would read Romans 8 as, You see covenant, and we'll talk about that next time, covenant and election tied up with the revealing of God's people on the final day. It does say that we've already been adopted, but then it says the creation waits expectantly for the revelation, the revealing, the unveiling of the people of God. Again, that's in the Bible, but for the Reformed, that's a really important piece of what we mean by creation and providence. There's an unveiling waiting to happen. The creation, best way we can say it is, Edward says it well, creation is the theater of redemption. Creation is really kind of the palette, the template on which God wants to display all of his redemptive works in conjoining sense with his redemptive or his creation works, okay? They're spoken of, again, grace and glory, right? So they're in conversation at all times. And that's also why we believe, again, another doctrine a little later on in Christology, that Jesus is the second Adam, the better Adam, the final man who fulfills the covenant of works and completes the covenant of grace. And that'll be in another discussion. But you start to see how all these doctrines are related. But creation and providence have to spill into covenant and eschatology and election as well. They all relate together, okay? So why does God create? He creates for his glory, to reveal, to show, to share, to speak, to illuminate, to radiate in his creation all of his perfections. And therefore, it's good for us. So it's not because God needed something, but because we need something. We need him. And so we want to adore him from the depths of our hearts and worship him, because it is not just right, though it is also good for us. It's good for us to worship the Creator because he is perfect, right? So, whether it's Athanasius or Anselm, and the idea of the perfect being, right, that God is perfect in all of his perfections. He alone is wise and good. He is worthy of praise. So we are kind of most centered when we are worshiping our Creator. And so it's not just because God is glorifying himself, it's because it's for our good to glorify God, okay? So that's a very simple way of saying the doctrine of creation with the Reformed understanding of what creation is really all about. It's about the end. It's, the end is even in the beginning. It's connected to that, tethered to that, grace into glory, glory being the consummation of grace. And then what is providence really? Providence is essentially kind of the doctrines of foreknowledge or foreordination. We see them tethered together, that God's will and knowledge is intimately connected, whereas the Arminian and others would not. They would see those separated, and the Lutherans as well. But we would see that the doctrine of providence is God working out his decreed will in history in a very efficacious sense and in all grooves and nooks and crannies of the world. So there's not some part that God's not governing. God's governing all things. And, we think of the doctrine of sovereignty. It's very related to providence. But providence is more related to the outworking of God's decreed will in history and his care and his governance and his sustaining power for the world that he loves, because he created this world. So when John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world," there's a providential love of God right there. However, there's also a providential particular will of God for his people. So there's the Reformed view on providence, that it's not just God sovereignly in kind of a general sense, but God's sovereign in a very particular sense, because he is working for, bringing out, unveiling, revealing his covenant people for the whole cosmos, the world, to see. So there's a little bit of a unveiling on the creation stage, providentially, who are the people of God for the whole world to watch and to witness. So that's, again, the Reformed view, where it's also all things are decreed. All things are providentially within God's will. Even the sin, even all the suffering, all those things. And we have a very important way of nuancing that God is not the first cause of sin, but creatures are the cause of sin. God is not causing sin to happen, okay? God is not the author of sin. It's very, very clear in chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, and even Calvin distances himself pretty strongly in his Institutes. And so do, I would say, 95% or more little bit more than that probably, of Reformed thinkers. There's a handful that don't, and I think they're wrong. But providence has to do with all the things, and it's not just God being passive, but in his decree, he includes all things that come to pass, and not just permitting sin, but he is using sin for his glory and for the good of his people. And we don't know how all that works out. We just have to learn to trust the Lord in that mystery. But it's not this kind of providence is just this general thing, but it's a very specific God's governance and sovereignty over his world, yet with a view, a teleology, okay, of demonstrating, unveiling, revealing his people on the stage of creation in the final day, the great judgment day, the great assize, as the theologians like to say. So that's kind of the simple way of saying the doctrine of creation and providence in a Reformed theological view. Very, very simple, very quick kind of take on that, but that's how they're related in our thought. What are some traditional heresies that would respond to creation and providence in a way that just would be unbiblical, not just for Reformed, but in general, okay? And I can think of a lot, but they all kind of get summarized in three views, essentially. And I'll be quick about it, but it is important to also kind of distance ourselves from these perspectives. First is the common view, a philosophy known as dualism. And there's a lot of religions that fit into this category, especially Eastern mystical traditions and lots of Greek religions as well, where there's essentially kind of a side-by-side paralleling of two realities. You know, Eastern mystics call it yin and yang or whatever, but the reality is that there's a dualism that is next to one another, where there are two realities. They're kind of competing realities most of the time, good and evil or something like that, or God and Satan or something like that. And you see this in the Gnostics especially, where it's you know, the spirit and the matter, or, you know, spirit in the material world. Material world's bad, the spirit is good, and the material world is kind of run, you know, by an Old Testament evil God kind of idea. You know, you also see this in the Greeks, specifically Plato and Aristotle. You see kind of this what's called Platonism, of course, from that, where you see the somehow the immaterial, you know, is better than the material, but, you know, the material world might even have an eternity to it of some kind. And again, there's kind of a dualism there, where both kind of have a side-by-side relationship. One does not beget the other. They just always have been. So that's important also to know. And then, of course, the Manichaeans, which St. Augustine was a part of for a while, kind of have a similar Gnostic view that essentially matter is evil and spirit is good, and have some strange views on energy and consuming watermelons and melons and things like that, on how it all works out together with them. But it's also a dualistic conception of reality that the Bible has to strongly disagree with. The second perspective that's pretty well known is of course more of the modern Western take of evolution, and the evolutionary idea that really is tethered to a kind of a mechanistic view of matter, that matter somehow is all there is. Most of the time in evolutionary theory, matter in the seen world is really all there is, and there's nothing really behind that. But it can't account really for an origin. It's really just a theory. It's kind of a theory that the world has always been. Matter is almost an eternal kind of thing most of the time for evolutionary theorists. And again, there's a mechanistic aspect to it where they can't see behind, because it's an observational scientific process, but they notice the movements and the constant changing of everything. So the problem with all of this is that there's really no knowledge of who's directing it. So they might give an origins theory, but they don't know if it's, you know, a personal God or if it's just happenstance. You know, they observe the mechanics of how things are kind of working in the world with energy and matter and things like that. But it's kind of capricious and arbitrary to them. There's no purpose and method behind it. There's nothing orchestrating this kind of symphony of movements going on in the universe. And of course, there's really no understanding of where it's going, right? So there's no sense of telos. There's no sense of end. So again, it's very mechanistic. It's typically kept to just the material world most of the time. Though even Darwin was an agnostic, actually, wasn't an atheist. So again, there's this kind of skepticism about naturalism most of the time, but it's more of a mechanistic view of the world that does not account for the invisible things that are behind the scenes, and also involved very much with the material world, as Hebrews 11:3 says. And then lastly is kind of a Enlightenment period, though it's always existed, but especially in the Enlightenment with Spinoza and Hegel later on and others. And it's a fairly popular view actually even today, not just in the East but also in the West, and it's pantheism. And pantheism is essentially that God is the world, that somehow, we are gods, whatever, people say like that, like Oprah and other people, but the idea that basically the world itself is God, okay? And as part of the creation, we are God. Kind of that idea where it confuses God's, concern with the world or his involvement with the world, his immanence, as we would say, with God himself. God's immanence is declared to be God, So the material world that's created has this kind of divinity to it in their view. And whether it's, God emanating himself in matter and expressing himself in phenomena, it's basically coinciding that that is God himself. And we have to strongly disagree with that, given that the Lord makes the universe by a free act, is not dependent upon that world in any sense, is free from it in the sense of dependency, but freed for it in Bavinck's term, which is just mind-blowing. Like he creates the world to be free for the world, to serve the world. It's like amazing. But it's not to be confused with the world, okay? The world is to be dependent upon God, not the other way around. So I hope this has been a helpful short video to help you understand the Reformed view on creation and providence. It's really tied to covenant and election as well, but we really can't get all that into that at one time. And I think we'll probably do at least covenant. We'll probably include election in next time to talk about those relationships. But if there's a chapter you really would like to read to read more about the Reformed perspective on these things, it would be Romans chapter 8, because it really ties all these ideas together of God's creation and consummation, how they relate together with his providential outworking of his will, of course, in the whole world, yes. Resurrection, Jesus Christ is resurrected, and it has an effect and a purpose with the whole universe, but particularly with the people of God, that God wants to unveil as his adopted children by grace. So I hope that's helpful, and next time we'll probably do covenant and election. All right, signing off.